to me. We'll make a new tomorrow. Talk to me. What makes this happy face go? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face go?
Alrighty. Good evening. There's my sound. Alright. Okay, so we are down to the last two articles of Forbidden Religion. So that is what we're going to do tonight. And then, I already showed it on Twitter, but in case anybody's watching, we are going to be starting into David Bryan Davis's The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, the 1967 Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's the first book of his I will have read. I've got several of them. They sounded interesting enough, I went ahead and picked them up, especially where I could get them for just a few bucks each. So anyway, that's what we're doing. That's where we are. Let's jump into the articles. So, Article 39, Understanding the Near-Death Experience. Why Hasn't Science Gotten It Right? By P.M.H. Atwater. Okay. No one can validate a near-death experience except the one who experienced it. The thrust, then, of near-death research is to identify elements and patterns of occurrence, after effects, and implications in an attempt to understand how and why the phenomenon happens, what it is, and what can be learned from it, especially as it concerns an examination of existence and the prospect of life after death. What is passed off today as the near-death experience in movies, television, talk shows, and popular best-selling books bears little resemblance to the actual phenomenon. Documentary film producers, for instance, have opted for a mythological portrayal of what they think the public wants to see, cast against obligatory detractors who have never done any actual research in the field and frankly don't know what they're talking about, rather than tackling an in-depth examination of core findings, especially those that challenge the standard Amazing Grace scenario. Hundreds now claim to be experts on the subject, yet they have precious little to back up their claim except for a few dozen near-death survivor interviews, uh, lunch with their favorite researcher, and a literature search. The frenzy of trendy books and charismatic speakers it has resulted feeds on itself, never once addressing the most important question of all. What if the original findings about the near death experience are incomplete or misleading? Oh, before I go on, real quick, there is a picture. The caption is a detail of ascent in the Empyrean, painted by Hieronymus Bosch in the late 15th or early 16th century. It appears to anticipate some modern accounts of near-death experience. So it's really dark. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it. Um, see if I can get in closer and get the. There we go. Focus. There we go. So there we. That's best I'm going to be able to do with that. All right. Moving on. To address this question, we must reevaluate the premise of near-death studies and the methodology used to arrive at their premise. Research on the phenomena goes back more than 150 years, but the work didn't take root as a discrete scientific discipline until after Dr. Raymond A. Moody, Jr. coined the term near-death experience and published his first book, Life After Life, in 1975. Kenneth Ring, Ph.D., opened wide the floodgates for serious inquiry by scientifically verifying Moody's work in 1980 and publishing his book, Life After Death. The classical model of the near-death experience was established by this effort. Its 8 basic elements follow. Descriptions are my own. Okay. So, 1. A sensation of floating out of one's body, often followed by an out-of-body experience during which all that goes on around the vacated body is both seen and heard. 2. Passing through a dark tunnel or black hole, or encountering some type of darkness, often accompanied by a feeling or sensation of movement or acceleration. Wind may be heard or felt. 3. Ascending toward a light at the end of the darkness, a light of incredible brilliance that emits loving peacefulness, and possibly seeing deceased individuals, animals, plants, lush outdoors, and even cities within that light. 4. Receiving greetings from friendly voices, people, or beings who may be strangers, loved ones, or religious figures. Conversation can ensue, information or a message may be given. 5. Seeing a panoramic view of the life just lived, from birth to death, or in reverse order, sometimes in the form of reliving the life rather than a dispassionate review. The person's life may be seen in its entirety or in segments. This is usually accompanied by a feeling or need to assess losses or gains during the life and determine what was learned or not learned. Other beings can take part in this judgment-like process or offer advice. 6. An altered sense of time and space. Discovering time and space do not exist, losing the need to recognize either of these measurements of life as valid or necessary. 7. A reluctance to return to the earth plane, but invariably realizing that either one's job on Earth is not finished, or a mission must yet be accomplished before one can leave the Earth plane. And 8. Disappointment at being revived, often feeling a need to shrink or somehow squeeze down to fit back into the physical body. There can be unpleasantness, even anger or tears at the realization that one is now back in one's body and no longer on the other side. Since the average near-death experience contains about 5 of these elements, people who may have had such an episode become confused. This has given rise to a major complaint voiced by those who attend either local meetings of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS, or their their friends of IANDS affiliates in the United States, Canada, and internationally. The complaint? What happened to them doesn't match the quote unquote classical model. Common experiences more closely match the model I developed, explained below. Knowing nothing about near-death studies when I began my own research in 1978, I isolated four distinct types of near-death experience. The elements were similar to those that comprise the classical model, but the patterning was different, and there were subtle psychological factors that seemed somehow to undergird each type, as if other forces were at work besides the prospect of life after death. What I found has held up during the years since then, regardless of one's age, education, gender, culture, or religion. In Beyond the Light, I discuss this at length with a separate chapter for each of the four types, plus the near death experience anomalies and the profile of psychological and physiological after effects that was revealed in my work. What follows is a brief version of the four types of near death experience I discovered. Initial experience, an introduction to other realities, involves elements such as loving nothingness, the living dark, a friendly voice, a brief out-of-body experience, and or visitation of some kind, usually experienced by those who seem to need the least amount of evidence for proof of survival, or who can tolerate the least amount of shake-up in their lives at that point in time. Often this becomes a seed experience or an introduction to other ways of perceiving and recognizing reality. That was one. Two, unpleasant and or hell-like experience, an opportunity for inner cleansing and self-confrontation. An encounter with a threatening void or stark limbo, or fearful creatures of darkness or hellish purgatory, or scenes of startling and unexpected indifference, even hauntings from one's own past, usually experienced by those who seem to have deeply suppressed or repressed guilt, fears, and anger, and those who expect some kind of punishment or discomfort after death. 3. Pleasant and or heaven-like experience, an opportunity for reassurance and self-validation. Pleasuring pleasurable scenes of loving family reunions with those who have died previously, reassuring images of religious figures, light beings, angels, validation that life counts, affirmative and inspiring dialogue. Can include a review of the life, personal advice given and or family secrets revealed, usually experienced by those who most need to know how loved they are and how important life is and how every effort has a purpose in the overall scheme of things. And the fourth one, transcendent experience, an introduction to alternate realities and to expansive states of greater insight. Exposure to otherworldly dimensions and scenes beyond the individual's frame of reference often includes revelations of grander truths. Seldom follows any particular pattern of imagery, geared towards societal and evolutionary issues, not personal concerns per se, usually experienced by those who are ready for a mind-stretching challenge and or individuals who are most apt to utilize to whatever degree the truths imparted to them. For any given person, it is possible for all four types to occur during the same experience, or for two or more to occur in varying combinations, or for all four types to spread out across a series of episodes in a particular individual's life. Generally speaking, however, each represents a distinctive type of experience occurring but once to a given person. In addition to my own attempts to clarify the nature of the near-death experience, there has been in recent years a concerted effort made by other researchers of near-death states to quote-unquote set the record straight as to percentages of occurrence of this phenomenon. Most surveys conducted by various magazines and organizations in the past were not scientific or even reliable. The problem is ambiguous questions that slant answers. The result, overestimates based more on wishful thinking than on anything close to verifiable facts. The poll used today, giving an estimate of 15 million near-death experiences in the United States, or 5% of the population, was conducted by U.S. News and World Report in 1997. However, the figure, more in keeping with actual case reportings in the United States, Holland, and Germany, is 4%, which makes 11 million in the United States. What is of keen interest to researchers is that the 4% figure for general populations is showing up in other countries worldwide. Because of this, researchers are downscaling the percentages they quote. Some references random inquiry in Germany, uh, Schmid, no, Schmid et al., um, conducted in 1999, and the original Gallup poll done in 1982. For those people who were near death, nearly died, or who did die but later revived or were resuscitated, the estimate of one-third that was previously used to indicate how many would have a near-death experience is also overinflated. The number is closer to between 12 to 20%. The real problem here, though, is with children. There's never been any survey of any kind that addresses children who experience a near-death state. A given assumption in poll taking is that an individual's near-death experience occurred in adulthood. Preliminary work by Melvin Morse, MD, a pediatrician in the state of Washington, suggests that with children the figure is closer to 70%, more than double that of adults. Since Morse's work has yet to be duplicated, especially in other countries, no conclusions can be drawn as to what this discrepancy means. It can be said that near-death cases are on the rise. What cannot be said with any real degree of confidence is by how much. To better understand why my work deviates from that of other researchers, it might be helpful to know how I fit into the scheme of things. In 1978, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified me as a near-death survivor and described the now famous classical model. She never mentioned Raymond Moody or his book, nor did I hear of either of these until 1981, when Kenneth Ring bought my self-published rendering I Died Three Times in 1977 and located me via telephone. During an overnight visit, he was surprised to learn that I had been independently researching the near-death experience and its after effects and had amassed a great deal of material. My self-published rendering has since been resurrected and is now available on my website at Ring's invitation. I became the columnist for Vital Signs magazine, a publication of the newly formed International Association for Near-Death Studies, where I began to share some of the observations I had made, observations that later became the book Coming Back to Life. Never was it my interest or intent to verify or challenge anyone else's work. My job, as I was shown during my third near-death experience, was to bring clarity and perspective to the phenomena and to test the validity of its revelation. Thus I became a field worker whose specialty is interviews, observation, and analysis. I cross-check everything I do at least 4 times with different people in different parts of the country as a way to ensure that any bias I may have as a near-death survivor will not cloud my perception. Questionnaires, for me, are auxiliary, used only to further examine certain aspects of near-death states. All of my work is original. Whenever possible, I also interview significant others as well as experiencers. This work has been a full-time profession for me since 1978, in addition to employment that has helped pay for groceries. To date, I have interviewed over 3,000 adult experiencers and 277 child experiencers, not counting friends and loved ones. This number doubles if one counts the interviews I conducted between 1966 and 1976 in an effort to understand altered states of consciousness and mystical and spiritual transformational experiences. In my research of near death states, I don't use the standard double blind control group method that most professionals employ because I don't trust it. Initial screening with this style, whether in person or by mail, is dependent upon questions that use terms in advance of the experiencer's response and lead the answers, in the sense that certain questions tend to inspire predictable answers. Most of these questionnaire formats have the same antecedent, geared to proving or disproving a single model, the classical one. Certainly, when everyone uses the same basic research style and instruments, better and more accurate comparisons can be made, and this is desirable on one level. But what if the original work was incomplete or perhaps biased in the sense of a preference, either the researcher's or that of the experiencer, consciously or subconsciously? I mean to impart no criticism here, for I know how sincere and diligent most experiencers and researchers are, and how difficult it is to maintain objectivity. Nevertheless, it is time for us to admit that um, 1. No allowance was made during the early years in the field for inquiries about unpleasant and or hellish experiences. 2. Experiencers who had difficulty accepting or integrating their experience were for a long time simply ignored. 3. Few people ever reported the tunnel component, yet the tunnel was and still is considered a signature of the phenomenon. 4. Seldom was attention paid to episodes devoid of light, even though they were as intense and life-changing as the radiant ones. 5. The full spread of psychological and physiological after effects went unrecognized for more than a decade. 6. Children's scenarios were assumed to be the same as adult scenarios, with similar responses until recent research indicated otherwise. 7. Attempted suicides that occurred after an experience were missed. And 8. Correlations between life experiences and what was met in the near-death scenario, the sense that what happened was needed, were generally bypassed in favor of the notion that near-death states were a distinctly separate phenomenon. Both the preference factor, seeing in the experience what we want to see, and the pathological approach, thinking it's something we can dissect like heart disease, fail utterly to address the complex dynamic that is the near-death experience. Today, in almost every discipline, previous studies are being overturned or revamped, not because past authors were inept, but because their research base was not broad enough to adequately cover their field of inquiry. Since I've already mentioned heart disease, let me use it as an example. We now know that the original model for the treatment of heart disease was faulty. Its primary source came from work done on men. When women were finally studied separately, vast differences were uncovered in how each sex reacts, which led to the creation of a more effective model. I'm not suggesting that near-death states are in any way a pathology, but I am saying that the same premise applies. We need to broaden our research base. Few people realize that Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, formulated his theories while treating 22 people. That humankind is ennobled and spiritual by nature was lost in his investigation of the dark and animalistic urges that these 22 people exhibited, something I've been saying since I started studying psychology way back when. Exactly like the situation with heart disease, a model of limited parameters was accepted as true for all. Over the years, more people have been hurt than helped by the distortions in Freud's theory. Absolutely. Near-death studies have been caught in the same situation, a tendency to over-rely on a single methodology. Empirical research can be conducted utilizing a number of different approaches, and I count mine as one of them. Past discoveries in the field of near-death studies are praiseworthy, but observer and slash analysts like myself are needed to track a myriad of details control group studies cannot address. If we are ever to understand the near-death phenomenon, we must examine it from 360 degrees. Anything less is unacceptable. For instance, why do we keep relying on medical investigators in surgical wards for verification of the phenomena when, with neither adults nor children, is the principal venue, quote unquote, death during surgery? This was a reasonable choice during the early years of research, but modern hospitals are turning more and more to the use of a new drug that causes amnesia in patients. Are near death cases on the decline, as a recent study suggests, or are the patients simply unable to remember the experience because of the new drug? And just because I don't trust pharmaceutical companies or doctors in any way anymore because of all the nonsense, could that be deliberate? If we're serious about seeking subjects within the confines of a hospital, why don't we hang out in emergency wards? The majority of cases of children in my study, for instance, came from drownings and suffocation, not surgery. To be fair, the controlled group method of research developed about 100 years ago was a reliable way to study the effect of a single agent acting on a single illness that had a single cause. But that method becomes ineffectual when exploring complex issues like transformations of consciousness. Charles Tart, PhD, terms such abuse scientism. Tart inter- internationally known for his experiments with altered states of consciousness, and one of the founders of the field of transpersonal psychology, is the author of two classics in the field of consciousness studies, Altered States of Consciousness and Transpersonal Psychologies. According to Tart, the job of science is to give us information so we can make sense of life experiences. Scientism, on the other hand, states in rigid and dogmatic terms what reality is and should be. That sounds familiar. Tart identifies a true skeptic as one who searches for truth, withholding the temptation to establish finality, and pseudo-skeptics are as those who insist on one path to truth and one reality. Tart reminds us that science evolved from philosophy and depends on open inquiry. In the spring of 1999, Three Rivers Press of New York City brought out my book, Children of the New Millennium. Because of problems in publishing, it was replaced in 2003 by The New Children and New Death Experiences. I want people to know about the change because the book is a major study of children's near-death states, including those of infants and toddlers, and of how such experiences affect the young, especially during critical junctures in brain development. This is important information. The book also covers the new child currently being born, our global village babies, who are quite unlike those of previous generations. The new children and near-death experiences and entices the public to think and rethink not just about near-death studies, but also about ourselves as human beings, what we think we are and where we think we're headed. As evolution continues to play leapfrog with our futures, it is a book filled with surprises. And that is the end of that article. And I believe most of these articles were written um, in the late 90s and early 2000s. So this book was published in 2006. So he must have been talking about um, Gen Z, I guess. He could have been talking about millennials, but that would be if he wrote the well, because he mentions 2003, so he must be talking about Gen Z when he's talking about the new children. So interesting. Um, all right. Last article: the case for reincarnation. Is religion the only reason to believe, or is there evidence of a more scientific nature? By Ian Lawton. And this is the last article in the book. Everyone knows that many Eastern religions hold the doctrine of reincarnation at their core. It is not explicitly found in ancient Vedic texts, although their high philosophy can be somewhat obscure at times, and some scholars argue that the idea would have been present in general Vedic thought. The concept is certainly a cornerstone of the Hindu religion that sprang from that philosophy. By contrast, when the Buddha took his teachings outside of the Hindu mainstream, he was deliberately vague about the idea of reincarnation, arguably in an attempt to take his followers away from their reliance on the tight strictures of the Hindu caste system and the assumption that they'd always be reborn into the same caste. Unfortunately, his vagueness became enshrined in the doctrine of anatta, or no self/soul, whereby one's karma was thought to be added to the universal pot after death, while the individual soul did not survive as a distinct entity. Despite the setback, Western esotericism has a long history of belief in reincarnation. As I discuss in my second book, Genesis Unveiled, a belief in reincarnation was fundamental to both Hermeticists and Neoplatonists, although not, interestingly, Gnostics or even the ancient Egyptians, from whom much of this latter thought was supposedly derived. And to this day, reincarnation continues to thrive as a cornerstone of Kabbalism, although, again, the Judaism from which this sprang does not explicitly incorporate it, and also of the Rosicrucian movement. But all of these worldviews effectively rely, just as any of the major religions do, on the revealed wisdom of their sacred texts. I think many people in the modern world have come to realize that revealed wisdom can contain horrible distortions, however much the disciples of any given worldview might insist otherwise. So at the start of the 21st century, must we continue to rely on such ancient revealed wisdom in our research for spiritual truths? The answer is an emphatic no. There are two major sources of modern research into reincarnation. The first is past life regression. The second is children who spontaneously remember past lives. And before anyone of a more skeptical bent accuses me of spouting New Age nonsense by using this material, I should emphasize that I too had assumed that it would be easily dismissed by proper, rigorous scientific investigation. But when I investigated it myself, I found I could not have been more wrong. In fact, materialist explanations for these phenomena are inadequate and reductionist, and they concentrate on the weak cases without attempting to tackle the stronger ones. I should also emphasize that the professionals who pioneered research in these areas during the 60s and 70s were scientifically trained psychologists and psychiatrists, most of whom were initially of a skeptical or atheistic persuasion. The key elements in using past life regression as proof of reincarnation lie in the cases that fall into two categories. The first and most obvious are those in which historical details emerge that are not only verifiable but also so obscure that they could not have been obtained by any normal means. Those in which the possibility of deliberate deception, which is about the only materialist explanation that might have held water in these cases, is so remote as to be negligible. Three examples serve to make my point. Gwen MacDonald, an Australian woman who had never been abroad, was regressed by the pioneering psychologist Peter Ramster. She remembered obscure details in the 18th century life of a girl named Rose Duncan, who lived in Glastonbury. When this was further investigated in England by an Australian documentary film crew under controlled conditions, the details were all verified by local historians and residents. These details included obscure or obsolete names of places and people, obsolete elements in local dialect, and details of houses and other buildings as they had existed in 18th century. Most stunning was the woman's insistence that she had been taken to a cottage, the floor stones of which had been stolen from Glastonbury Abbey. One floor stone had an obscure carving on it that she sketched while still in Sydney. She led the crew to what had become a dilapidated chicken shed, and they swept away decades of droppings. There was the carving exactly as she had drawn it. Another of Ramster's subjects was Cynthia Henderson, who was brought over to France by the same documentary team. She remembered the life of an aristocratic girl named Amélie de Cheville, who lived in the 18th century. Not only did she lead them to the ruined chateau in the country outside Flers in Normandy, which she had accurately described as her home before leaving Australia, but in trance she spoke in the fluent archaic French of the period, with a perfect accent, as verified by a local man employed specifically to test this hypothesis. Out of her trance she was unable to recall more than a few basic words of French gleaned from no more than 2 months of study at the age of 12. The third case involves a Welsh housewife named Jane Evans, who was regressed live on television by Arnall Bloxham. She recalled life as part of a persecuted Jewish community in York in the 12th century, and circumstances that it resulted in a number of Jews, including herself, taking refuge in the crypt of a local church, where they were eventually discovered and massacred. Professor Barry Dobson, an expert on Jewish history at York University, was called in to investigate. From descriptions provided by Jane Evans, he established that the church she referred to must have been St. Mary's, Castlegate. But there was one problem. It had no crypt. Some months later, when workmen were renovating the church, they discovered a crypt that had been sealed off. When they broke it open, they discovered human remains dating to the 12th century. The other way in which past life regression provides impressive proof of reincarnation is in those cases that involve dramatic therapeutic benefits. Many pioneering past life therapists discovered the technique more or less by accident, often when regressing patients back to their childhoods. Imprecise commands were taken literally by those under hypnosis. When asked, for example, to go back further, they suddenly began describing events that could not have related to their current life. Intrigued, the pioneers continued their experiments and found that severe psychological and psychosomatic disorders that had often remained virtually untouched by years of conventional therapy were completely alleviated, sometimes after only a few sessions of past life therapy. Irrespective of whether or not the patient, or for that matter the therapist, believed in reincarnation. It was this universal experience that convinced all of the pioneers that this was no mere placebo effect and that reincarnation is a reality. We turn now to children who remember past lives spontaneously, as opposed to under hypnosis. The American psychologist Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia pioneered research on this subject almost single-handedly for several decades. He is only now starting to achieve the recognition he so richly deserves. Many of his cases also involve verifiable details that are so obscure that they could not have been obtained by normal means, unless deliberate collusion and deception were involved. Stevenson's methodology has been deliberately designed to spot this and other suspect patterns. To focus on just one of his impressive cases from an early age, Swarnlata Mishra spontaneously recalled details of the life of another Indian girl named Biya Patak, who had lived in a separate town some way away from her present home, and whose family was eventually traced. Stevenson found that in all, Swarnlata made 49 statements about her previous life, only a few of which could be regarded as inaccurate, and 18 of which were made before there had been any contact whatsoever between the two families. These statements included identifying former family members, sometimes while being actively misdirected, coming up with little-known nicknames and even disclosing to her former husband that he had taken 1,200 rupees from her money box, something known only to the two of them. Um, I am going to pause right there because there is a picture. Dr. Ian Stevenson, whose groundbreaking work in the field of reincarnation provides astonishing evidence for the immortality of the soul. So it's just a tiny little black and white of the guy. No big deal, but I've shown every other picture, so I'll show that one. All right, getting back to it. There's one potential paranormal explanation for all this evidence that would not involve reincarnation, which is that all these subjects are tapping into some sort of universal memory or consciousness, and that the past lives accessed in this way do not belong to the individuals under study. Excuse me. But there are two extremely strong reasons to doubt this theory. First, therapeutic results could not be obtained if this was the case. And second, most cases of past life regression show clear karmic linkages between lives that are personal and individual. Nowhere is this more evident than in the most unusual cases investigated by Stevenson, those of children born with unusual birthmarks and defects. By investigating post-mortem reports and so on, he found that the number of these defects corresponded exactly to wounds that killed the previous personality claimed by the child and for whom other verifiable data had been found. The other possibility often mentioned, albeit still relying on reincarnation, is that all of these subjects are tapping into ancestral memories passed on in their genes. But again, this theory does not hold water for two good reasons. The first is that many past lives are found to be close together in time and yet to involve different continents or even races during an era when people were generally not particularly mobile. The second is that many of Stevenson's cases involve lives separated by only a few years, in which the two families involved are demonstrably not genetically linked. How does all of this modern evidence relate to the revealed wisdom of the past? Of course, the key corollary concept to that of reincarnation is that of karma, and the one thing that all approaches to reincarnation, both ancient and modern, are agreed upon is that we reincarnate repeatedly in order to progress our karma sufficiently to break free from the earthly karmic round, and in order to quote unquote reunite with the source. In other words, to reach the point where we have learned and experienced everything we can from earthly life. So we no longer need to incarnate to physical form, although souls who have advanced to this stage can, of course, volunteer to come back again to help humankind in general to progress. One of the interesting things that modern research can tell us about is the nature of the ethereal realms themselves and what exactly we mean by reuniting with the source. We find that subjects who have been regressed not just into past lives, but also into the interlife between incarnations, again by a number of pioneering psychologists and psychiatrists operating largely independently, have much to offer in terms of consistent spiritual wisdom. And remember that these are ordinary people drawn from all walks of life, who do not hold themselves out as spiritual gurus and who have no religious or political axe to grind. They report such a huge, rich, and varied amount of activity occurs in the ethereal realms. Souls at different levels of advancement are in training for all kinds of specialist work, from learning to be a spirit guide to other souls to experimenting with creating life by adapting existing blueprints to different environments. Implicit in all of this is that many other inhabited planets exist throughout the universe, some more physical than others. So, for example, we might advance enough to reunite with the earthly source or logos, but we would still have a massive way to go before we could could begin to appreciate, let alone reunite, with the ultimate creative source or power of the universe as a whole. We might also need to gain different types of experience by incarnating on other planets. This is rather more complex than the relatively simplistic idea held by most worldviews on reincarnation, that once we have finished with Earth, the ultimate source immediately awaits us. Some esoteric worldviews discuss hierarchies of angels and demons and different layers of heaven and hell and so on, and Kabbalism incorporates brave attempts to show that the ethereal realms are many layered, but they tend to represent somewhat rigid and hierarchical approaches. Whereas the modern evidence is practical and relatively down to earth. It removes a great deal of what, at risk of being controversial, is arguably no more than idle speculation from the process. To be even more practical in our approach, we need to understand that karmic advancement what karmic advancement really means, and how we go about achieving it. Again, past approaches in reincarnation have adopted different views of this process. For example, some of the more rigid philosophies have suggested that any sort of karma, whether good or bad, creates a reaction that must be completed. So the trick is to lead a life of such asceticism and to reject the physical world to such an extent that one creates no more karma. Fortunately, modern research suggests that this is complete nonsense based on the questionable premise that karma is about action and reaction. I don't think this guy has a full understanding of what karma is, and not that I do either, but my understanding is that karma is always negative. There's no such thing as good karma. There's karma. It's always bad, and you're supposed to rid yourself of karma in order to move on to the next state, whatever that is. Otherwise, you reincarnate, and you have a karmic debt to pay. But anyway, nowhere is this principle more in evidence than in the Hindu view that, for example, people who are disabled are being punished for some misdemeanor in their past. But can this be true? If we return to Stevenson's cases of birthmarks and defects, we find they give us a significant clue, even though their importance as pointers to karmic dynamics has not been properly addressed before. The subjects find themselves with what appears to be a physical punishment in their current life, and yet they were usually innocent victims in the previous life. How does that represent a karmic process of action and reaction? The answer, I have concluded, is that it does not. Modern modern interlife research shows that more advanced souls not only conduct detailed reviews of their past lives, but also plan their next ones. And even when they choose adverse circumstances such as physical disability or financial or emotional deprivation, they do so to progress their karma as part of a learning experience. But this research also shows that less advanced souls often ignore all review and planning advice in the interlife, and as a result, their lives tend to exhibit repetitive patterns. That actually reminds me of one of the um, um, ideas about reincarnation that comes from some denomination of Wicca. I don't remember which one, and I don't know where they borrowed it from, but it's that in between you choose your next life, what you want to do to experience it, because that's part of the process. Although that idea of reincarnation isn't that you want to get all the experiences done so you can move on. The whole idea is to reincarnate to keep experiencing things. So, for example, you might choose to be born as someone who is going to be wheelchair bound for their whole life so that you can experience that. But anyway, I digress. Um, This means they repeatedly face similar adverse circumstances, but they are given another opportunity to learn the lesson that escaped them in the past. not brought on by some sort of karmic punishment or dynamic of action and reaction. The most crucial test is to properly assimilate strong negative emotions of hatred, fear, jealousy, revenge, and so on, either during incarnate life or in the in the interlife. Sorry, I keep stumbling on that. So that they no longer hold their restrictive karmic charge. The unfortunates in the birthmark and defect cases seem arguably, through having no proper interlife experience, to have retained rather than diffused emotions of such power from their last life, that these were imprinted on the next body, although the defects might serve constructively as reminders that they have emotions from the past that need sorting out. Thus, the strongest conclusion from my analysis of modern evidence is that karma and karmic progression are about learning and experiencing both sides of every coin. There is no karmic law of action and reaction, and in fact, this aspect of the revealed wisdom of the past is not just misleading, but positively harmful as well. Another area in which much of the revealed wisdom of the past is brought into question by modern evidence is the latter's revelation of the extent to which we create our own surroundings in the ethereal realms based on our expectations and level of karmic advancement. And nowhere is this view more controversial than when we turn to ideas of hell and demons. Although a very few of the modern pioneers concentrate specifically on demonic possession, most find that their subjects are unanimous in the following view, that such ideas are merely human psychological constructs. This does not mean that they are not real in some people, and certainly those with the strong expectation that they will encounter demons and hellish states in the interlife might do so, but these will be psychic manifestations of their own making, with no permanent or underlying validity. The implication is that if, both individually and collectively, we stop feeding these psychic manifestations with psychic energy, they will wither and fade. I appreciate that some people might suggest that this is all very fine as far as it goes, but that in itself this modern research and analysis is reductionist and fails to capture the real essence of spiritual experience and esoteric wisdom. I accept that. To some extent, this may be true. Certainly, more advanced spiritual practitioners might well be exploring avenues beyond this relatively simple analysis. But even those who experiment constructively with powerful hallucinogens or are experienced in entering altered states of consciousness by meditation alone would be well advised to remember the extent to which they may be experiencing or even creating psychic constructs based on their own preconceived ideas, which therefore may have limited objective or underlying validity. In addition, in a more practical sense, if they have been working from a false premise about the workings of karma, for example, then I would argue that even these people might want to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate their approach. I have a strong belief that this new rational spirituality that modern research has made available to us can have a relatively empowering effect on us as individuals, and that if enough of us take in its main concepts on board, we have a genuine chance of altering the future of humanity for the better. End of book. That is it. That is the last of the last. So there's a whole list of books of related interest in the back. I may just look up some of those. Now, I've already read Forbidden History. That's on there. Forbidden Science is one I still have to read. It's in this series with the um, Gnostic philosophy, the mysteries of John the Baptist, the mystery traditions, Christianity and ancient Egyptian religion, the mystery of the Copper Scroll of Qumran, and Lucifer's Court are the ones on the books of related interest list. So I think I have most of them, so I'll be looking But anyway, that is it for Forbidden Religion. We're done. Starting Thursday, I will be reading The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. So get ready for that. I have a feeling that's going to be very interesting too, but more a heavier subject for sure. So anyway, yeah. It is early yet, so I'm going to see if there's anyone around to raid. If you'll bear with me just a minute or two. Um, it looks like Mr. Blitzer 79 is playing Witcher 3. Uh, Amarustic is playing Fortnite. I have no interest in Fortnite. Tofugo is also playing Fortnite. And MF Mikachu is playing Dead by Daylight. Of all of those, I'm most interested in Mr. Blitzer's, The Witcher 3. Although I would really prefer something else, but those are the only people I follow that are online at the moment. So, um, yeah, let's just call it. How about that? Um, I like to raid every night if I can, but if I'm not feeling it, um, I just won't do it. So, anyway, um, I will see you all tomorrow night for, let's see, tomorrow is Wednesday. So we're reading a Star Wars short story. And then I will get into some more Oblivion. I really need to start another game, but I'm into Oblivion at the moment, so I'm playing it pretty exclusively. So, see you later.